So, let's talk about speakers. Alright guys, so the whole point of this video is to take 4 completely different loudspeakers that occupy the same general price point and compare them to one another. Now to be clear, this is a comparison review. It's not a contest, which means by the end of this video there's going to be no winner per se. In fact, the whole point is to highlight what each of these different designs bring to the table. So with that said, let's begin by talking about the methodology that I used for this review. Alright, so when you get right down to it, my process is actually very straightforward. What I did is, first and foremost, I made sure that each speaker was broken in before I'd evaluate it. Once I was sure each speaker was broken in, I put it into the main system, and after that, I would just dial it in, throw a bunch of different music at it, throw a bunch of different gear at it, and observed how the speakers would respond to each different situation. Now, it's important to note that throughout this entire process, I did keep in regular communication with the manufacturers and distributors just to make sure that what I was listening to and what I was hearing was more or less in line with the speaker's known performance envelope. Other than that, that's it. Yeah, pretty straightforward stuff. Now, before I jump into the review, I need to mention 2 more things. The first thing is that this review is going to be centered almost entirely around music production. So if you're in a home theater, you might not find this review to be too useful. And the second thing is, I know there's a lot of guys out there who love sound clips. Honestly, this review is not going to have any, so if that's what you're looking for, let me save that disappointment for you right here and now. But provided all that's okay with you, let's talk about the speakers. Alright, so the CM9s. Honestly, guys, I think they're the most well-rounded speakers of the group, and it's for 2 reasons. Number 1, they're just easy to work with. I mean, it doesn't really matter if you have a big room or small room. It doesn't really matter if you have a receiver or if you have a stack of high-end separates. It doesn't matter if you have a tube amp, a Class D amp, a Class AB amplifier. Heck, they're not even that particular about room placement or the genres of music that you listen to. So B&W managed to create a speaker that's just incredibly easy to accommodate, and it's incredibly easy to get good sound out of them. And that's something I really appreciate. And the second thing is overall performance. These are a pair of speakers that offer you a pretty complete package. They have a fairly full range sound, and they're voiced in a way that's very easy to enjoy. For example, overall, I would say that they have a refined character to them. They have a top end that's just a little bit boosted, and they have bass that is, well, definitely boosted. In fact, let's talk about the bass. The bass on these speakers is actually tuned to what I like. There's a little bit extra down below, which means it's not going to be the quickest bass in the world, but it's going to sound very full, very punchy, and I think it actually serves most music types very well, and it's what allows the speaker to sound so good in pretty large spaces. Moving up from that, we have the mid-range, and this is where I think the CM9s really shine. That Kevlar mid-range they use is phenomenal. It's very open sounding. What it really does is the way that it extracts subtle detail so effortlessly is done in a way that reminds me of $6,000 to $7,000 loudspeakers. So this is where the CM9s really punch above their weight. And then we have the top end. And the top end is going to be very smooth. It's going to have plenty of detail. And this is the one area to where I think B&W becomes a little bit polarizing. Some people absolutely love the way that they handle the upper mid-range and highs. Other people do not. For me, the biggest criticism that I could launch is B&W speakers tend to have a very, hey, look at me, look what I can do type of presentation. And it's kind of a give and take, because on one hand, when you drop down all this money on a pair of speakers, you want to hear your investment, and that's exactly what B&W gives you. But when you're a seasoned audiophile, there are times when you really don't want to hear the loudspeakers, you just want to hear the music for what it is. So that's my subjective criticism of the CM9. Otherwise, it's a very, very well-rounded loudspeaker. I really enjoyed my time with them. So now it's time to move on to the Definitive Technology Mythos STS. Alright, so even though I just called the B&W CM9s the most versatile speakers of the bunch, the Definitive Technology Mythos STS isn't too far behind. For example, they're just very easy speakers to accommodate. Like with the CM9s, it doesn't really matter if you have a small room, a medium-sized room, or a large room. It doesn't really matter if you're just running them off of a receiver or if you have a stack of high-end separates. It doesn't really matter what kind of music you like. The only difference is that the definitive technology speakers, I feel, are just a little bit more picky or selective about how they're placed into a room. With the CM9s, you can pretty much throw them anywhere and get pretty consistent performance. But with the Mythos STS, I feel like it takes just a little bit more time to position them properly and to really experience what they can do. Now, when it comes to sound, I would say that they both have a similar characteristic of having a very open, slightly forward presentation. Now, with the definitive technology Mythos, I feel like the mid-range is going to be very quick, almost just as quick as the CM9s, but there's going to be a little bit less meat on the bone. So that's going to be probably the biggest problem with these speakers, in my opinion, is that when it comes to mid-range performance, yes, everything's very squeaky clean, very clear, but I do wish that there was just a little bit more weight, a little bit more heft in the mid-range. Now the top end is going to actually be very spacious sounding, a little forward, a little tilted up, but nonetheless it's going to offer you a lot of detail, so whether you like music or movies, there's pretty much nothing they're going to skip out on. And then we have the bass, which is going to be their strong suit. For such a tiny tower, man, these things can output a lot of quality bass. And the best thing is, because they're powered towers, you can customize it. So if you want a lot of bass, you can dial that in. If you don't want a lot of bass, you can dial that in. So it's cool to have that flexibility there. Overall, I would say that they're very good speakers. I think Definitive Technology really hit the nail on the head with them when it comes to offering really good sound from such a tiny little speaker. Personally, I prefer the sound of the Mythos STS with a good tube amplifier. I think that really brings out their best. It kind of calms down the tweeter a little bit. It fleshes out that mid-range, and you just get this wonderfully engaging, complete sounding presentation. Anyways, that's just my take on the Mythos STS. Really good speakers, and now let's talk about the Klipsch RF-7 IIs. So one of the most unfair things that I hear audiophiles say about Klipsch speakers is that, they're just for rock and roll. And while it's true they do actually sound pretty good with rock and roll, there's a lot more to them than just that. But the thing is, they're just not as easy to work with as the aforementioned speakers. For example, with the RF-7 IIs, you can't just throw them into any room and expect good sound. You do need to give them a little bit of space if you can. Also, you can't just throw them on a receiver and expect good sound. I mean, yeah, you might be able to get acceptable performance, but you're not going to hear what they're capable of. And most importantly, even if you have the right room and you have all these expensive electronics, you still need to know how to set them up properly. So unless you do all of that, you're really not going to understand what they can do. But when you get them dialed in right, man, they sound really good. So first and foremost, let's get the most obvious thing out of the way. These speakers sound bigger and badder than everything else in this review, hands down. So, and what it really is it just hammers home the fact that if you want to feel like a band is sitting in your living room and performing for you, then you're going to need a big speaker with big drivers that can move a whole bunch of air. And that's exactly what the RF-7 IIs do. So when it comes to performance, first let me start with the bass. The bass is what surprises me the most about these speakers, because you'd think with those big drivers, Klipsch would tune the speakers aggressively to give you this monstrous low end, but that's not what they did. They give you bass that's very quick, very clean, very clear, honestly, maybe even quicker and cleaner than the B&W CM9s and the Tech Mythos STS speakers. So that's impressive. The mid-range is huge. Yeah, this huge, wide open mid-range. It's probably not the most nuanced mid-range in the world. I think that's where the B&Ws and the Techs will beat them out. But it's still nonetheless very pleasant to listen to. It's not too forward. It's not too warm. They did a wonderful job with the mid-range. And then we have the top end. And the top end with the horn is where things get interesting. Because if you don't dial it in correctly, you're going to hear that horn. It's going to be bright. It's going to be fatiguing. And you're probably not going to like it. But when you get it dialed in, man, I have to say, it's really good. At low volumes, it's incredibly smooth, and as you ascend the volume upwards, it becomes very engaging and very realistic. It's not bright per se, but it has grit. It has the kind of grit that real live instruments have. So when you get them dialed in right, I think the Klipsch RF-7 IIs are an absolute steal for the money. So that's just my take on these speakers. Obviously, they're not to everybody's taste. They are difficult to accommodate, but they're very impressive. And the fact that they're actually designed and made right here in the United States, I think that's just a little cherry on top. Anyways, guys, now let's move on to the completely opposite end of the spectrum and talk about the little WLM Stellas. Alright, so it's come to my attention that WLM is essentially out of business, or at least that's what it looks like right now. So because of that, this review may not be too relevant, but I still want to go forward with it because now we're talking about how a compact two-way stacks up to a bigger speaker. What advantages and disadvantages does it bring to the table? Now, in the case of the Stella, it bears mentioning that it's the only speaker of this group that was designed with music playback as a priority. Now, the Stellas were very easy to accommodate speakers. You didn't have to work too hard to get good sound out of them. And when it comes to the sound, what they gave you is pretty much the advantages that you would expect with a good two-way speaker. The driver integration, in other words, the highs and mids and the lows, were definitely a notch better than everything else within this comparison. You definitely got speed that you didn't get with all the others. And the bass, well, the bass was nowhere near as powerful as the other speakers. And while the mid-range definitely didn't have the presence of any of the other speakers, what you did get was something that was a little bit more refined, a little bit more articulate, a little quicker, and you just got more insight into what was really going on with the recording. And that's kind of the benefit of going with a small two-way speaker. Now, one of the big advantages to the Stella is that they actually had this crossover or this filter or notch or whatever you want to call it on the back of the speaker that would help you to adjust the top end performance. So if you're somebody who likes a lot of top end, you could just turn a few notches in the back of the speaker and boom, there you go. You're going to get more top end. Or if you're actually offended by a lot of treble energy, you could turn it down and actually get a more softer and easier to listen to presentation. So that's a really cool feature that they had. Overall though, I would say this. It's definitely for somebody who values tone above all else, or for somebody who has a small room or a medium-sized room that can't accommodate a bigger speaker. Overall, I think there's a big market for something like that. Obviously, lots of two-way speakers sell, even in the United States. But it bears mentioning that, no, there's only so much a two-way speaker can do in terms of delivering that realistic sense of scale and volume that you get out of live music. But the trade-off is, well, at least you get the tone of that. And when you focus your attention towards, again, those small little drivers, what you get is a tone that's arguably more accurate than a similar priced larger speaker. Anyways, guys, that's my take. Now let's wrap up this whole thing with my final thoughts. Alright guys, so first and foremost, a big heartfelt thank you goes out to the manufacturers and distributors who participated in this review. Guys, it's been a long time coming, but hopefully people are going to take away something from this video. And the big thing is that there are a lot of variables that play into what we hear. Our rooms, the equipment we have, our ears, our listening bias, the kind of music we listen to. I mean, all these things just kind of come together that influence what we like. And it's important to realize that there is no best at a particular price point, especially when we're talking about $3,000 floor standing loudspeakers. There's only different. So when somebody on a forum is saying, oh yeah, this is the best ever, or even when a reviewer is saying, oh yeah, this is the best ever, bar none, hands down, you have to really be careful with major statements like that, because most of the time, no, it's usually not the best, it's just different. And when it comes to the speakers in this review, all of them do something unique, all of them do something wonderful, and all of them have their compromises with respect to their unique design choices. So guys, this has been a pleasure. Hopefully you all have taken something away from this. And as always, until next time, peace.